So far, I have not counted, but we've dealt with quite a few alleged contradictions in this class. Don't forget, if you'd like to turn in some, if you want, you can even go to the website. Go to the website, Skeptic's Annotated Bible, the one where there is a list of supposed contradictions. And we are taking most of these from that list. So if you want to go there and pick out one from the list and submit it, we can work on that. Bob, yes?
In one place, didn't it say that Elijah said, pray it wouldn't rain for 3 years, and another place, 3.5 years?
Something like that. We can look at that. That's one reference there is in James. Elijah, and how long it did not rain. Okay. Hopefully we'll come back next week and we'll discuss that. We'll make some preparations. Anybody else have one? If you think of one or find one, yes, Karen or Sarah. I'm back to calling you Karen.
In Esther, when they hang Haman's 10 sons, it says that they hang them or they slaughter them, and then later in the scriptures it says that they hang them. So I wasn't sure it's all simultaneous.
Okay. We can take a look at that. That may be like it was with Saul. Saul was killed on the battlefield, actually killed himself. Yeah, killed himself on the battlefield. And then when the Philistines came across his body, they took his body and Jonathan's body and hung them on the wall of the city so that everybody could see, here are our dead enemies. Which sounds very barbaric, but they still do that kind of stuff today. I don't know if you've seen the news, what's happening in Iraq, but it's horrible what's being done over there to people, but it's nothing new. We'll just keep on preaching the gospel. That's the only hope for the world. All right, so we'll next week, Lord willing, we'll look at Elijah and how long it rained or did not rain, and then we'll look at Esther and Haman's 10 sons, whether they were slain before or during the process of the hanging. Any others? Yeah, the class roster is going around. Get your mark on there so on Judgment Day you can say you were here. I checked the roster. Okay. Next question I've got down is about the burning of the temple. I need 2 readers. One for 2 Kings 25, verses 8 and 9, so it's 2 verses. Who'll take that one? Come on now, we're wasting time. Jenny. Jenny's always volunteering to read. Excellent. 2 Kings 25, 8 and 9. And then I need somebody else for 2 other verses in Jeremiah 52. Jeremiah 52, verses 12 and 13. Who'll take those? All right, Chuck. Jeremiah 52, 12 to 13. It's 2 Kings 25, verses 8 and 9, and then we're going to look at Jeremiah 52, 12 to 13. And what we're reading here are accounts from each of these books, each of these historical records about the day that Nebuchadnezzar's servant, as a military general, came into Jerusalem and when the temple was burned. So let's look at 2 Kings 25 first. Jenny?
Now on the 7th day of the 5th month, which was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, a servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He burned the house of the Lord, the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Even every great house he burned with fire.
So what day did Nebuzaradan come into Jerusalem? 7th day of the 5th month. And it says he came into Jerusalem and he burned the house of the Lord. All right, Jeremiah 52, 12 to 13.
The 10th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, who served the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire in the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down.
All right. What's the discrepancy between these two accounts? 3 days difference. One says he came into Jerusalem on the 7th day. Another says he came into Jerusalem on the 10th day. What's that? Multiple trips. Oh, it's not possible. It's not possible for him to come into Jerusalem on one day and then leave and come back 3 days later. That's not possible, is it?
Marty says he burns all the buildings. You can't do all that in one day. You need to go back and forth.
Okay, we got 3 days to set fires here. Is it possible that Nebuzaradan captured Jerusalem on the 7th day and came into the city, but did not burn the buildings until the 10th day? Or even as Billy said, maybe he started burning on the 7th day, but didn't get to the temple until the 10th day? What has to be the circumstance before we conclude that there is a definite contradiction? There has to be no way for both accounts to be true. Is there a reasonable explanation for the way these accounts are logged in the record? I think so. I think it's very possible, as a matter of fact, likely, that he came into Jerusalem on the 7th day. He entered, took the city, but was there a Motel 6 in Jerusalem? Probably wasn't much of anything, because the city had been under siege and there was no food. People were eating their own children. It was horrific, much like it was in AD 70. These two sieges of Jerusalem are very similar in nature. It was a horrific circumstance for the people living in the city. So he came in the city. I'm sure he didn't stay in the town for 3 days. He probably left, went back out to his own camp. Now, the record doesn't say that. This is speculation on my part, but it certainly makes sense to me. And I think it's a very plausible explanation that he probably came back into town each day to see how things were going on. He was the commander, after all. And then on that 3rd day from the original day, he came in on the 7th the first time, and then came back in on the 10th and said, okay, let's burn the temple. We pulled everything out of the temple that's of value, perhaps in those 3 days. Maybe that's what was happening. And then on the 10th day, burn the temple. I don't know, but I do know this. There's no reason that we have to conclude that these two accounts are contradictory. Any discussion, any observations you'd like to make, or questions you'd like to ask? Who wrote each account? The Jeremiah was, of course, written by the prophet Jeremiah. The Chronicles were a later record when they had a little more information about what was going on from 1st and 2nd Kings. 1st and 2nd Kings were written first, and then the Chronicles were written later. But they are basically two accounts of the same things happening.
So you could have two different writers saying it's slightly different, but it doesn't mean, because if it's a big city, it's going to take time to go through the chaos of capturing the city, like you say, take care of business that they're trying to do.
Right.
Who knows how long it will take? It could have taken 3 years.
And somebody who was observing, if you were, say there was a big tower in the middle of Jerusalem, and you're sitting up in that tower and you're writing down what happens. And on the 7th day of the 5th month, he comes into town. You could write, he came into town on the 7th day of the 5th month. And then after everything is over, you could say, he burned the temple and all the main buildings. You might not put down, he did that 3 days, he set the fire 3 days after he initially entered town, but that would be your observation after the fact.
It also might have been that he breached the walls on the 7th day, and it took him those 3 days to clear out the last pockets of defenders, and then begin actually burning the city.
It could be. That's another aspect altogether. Did everybody catch that? The walls were breached on the 7th day, so he came into Jerusalem, but he didn't actually take the whole city and start burning things until the 10th day.
Part of 2 Kings 25, if you go ahead and read 1 through 3, then verse 9, it kind of gives more insight of the whole chapter there. The place is under siege for 11 months.
Right.
It talks about him coming in and destroying.
7th day, it talks about 10 days, but it talks about the siege of the city was for 11 months going on. It didn't just happen overnight.
Sure.
Then the king showed up and burnt the temple and this, that, and whatever.
Well, if you think about it, almost any military operation, and I'm not sure of the dates, but somebody could ask, when did we go into Iraq? And you could give a date. And somebody would say, well, I was in northern Iraq and I didn't see any American troops. Oh, well, we didn't get up there until 3 months later or however, or half an hour later.
Yeah, same thing about Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan. You know, I was in Pakistan, Uzbekistan in 2005. In 91, you know, Desert Storm, everybody said, we wasn't there. And I said, well, yeah, you might not have been there, but I was there.
Billy was there. He's an American, so we had troops on the ground. So remember, it's not necessarily a contradiction unless there's absolutely no way for both accounts to be true. And we can see a very plausible explanation, a couple of them as a matter of fact, for both explanations, both accounts to be true. Any more discussion on this? Yes, Mike.
We live in an era, we're surrounded by Oklahoma City. And if somebody came through there, they wouldn't say that they were in Oklahoma City, they'd say they're in Harris. But, you know, they're in Oklahoma City. You can, cities spread out. I don't know how it would have been in the day of, when they had to have a defendable perimeter. But nevertheless, cities can be confusing as to what is what. It's possible that could be a part of the explanation too, because even under circumstances where they had walls around the city, there's still cities spread out beyond the walls.
Sure. Well, just like last week, we had our discussion about Jericho. Was Jesus entering Jericho or was he leaving Jericho? Well, there were two Jerichos. There was the old Jericho that was destroyed, and there was the new Jericho that was rebuilt. So he was leaving Jericho and coming into Jericho at the same time. A seeming contradiction, but if you understand the circumstance, there's no contradiction at all. All right, did God command the Israelites to make burnt offerings to him? Need a reader for Exodus 20:24? Who's got it? Exodus 20:24. All right, Jake. And Jeremiah 7:22. 7:22 in Jeremiah. Who's got that one? Jenny. Y'all gonna let Jenny read all these this morning? Exodus 20:24 and Jeremiah 7:22. And the question is, did God command the Israelites to make burnt offerings to him? And the authors of the Skeptic's Annotated Bible are claiming that there is a mistake here, that there's a contradiction. And let's see what they're talking about. Exodus 20:24.
You shall make an altar of earth before me, and you shall sacrifice on it burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you with blessing.
All right. Is there any question that God commanded the Israelites to make burnt offerings? This is one passage of several we could point to, go to, read, where it's very obvious that God's commanding the Israelites, especially the priesthood, to make burnt offerings. Any questions about that? I think we're all familiar to some degree with the sacrificial system and the burnt offerings. So let's read Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 22.
For I did not speak to your fathers, or command them in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt, concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices.
All right, just one verse, and what does he say? That I did not speak to your fathers or command them in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. Then read verse 23. Get a perspective. But this is what I commanded them, saying, obey my voice. What was the point of the entire law? Was the point burnt offerings or was the point obedience? And this is the point that God is trying to make. So that law wasn't about burnt offerings, is essentially what God is saying. If you go back to the first part of Jeremiah chapter 7, You read everything in context, it starts to make sense. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord saying, stand in the gate of the Lord's house and proclaim there this word and say, hear the word of the Lord, all you Judah who enter by these gates to worship the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, amend your ways and your deeds, and I will let you dwell in this place. What did the people come to the temple to do? To make sacrifices according to the law. That's what they came to the temple to do. How were they living their lives from day to day in Jeremiah's day? They were sinful, they were idolatrous, they were unfaithful, they were cheating each other, stealing from each other. They were worse, according to the accounts in the prophets, than a lot of the Gentiles were who were not even living under the covenant of God. Their obedience was non-existent. And so God is saying, Jeremiah, you go and you stand in the temple gates, and when the people come to worship, you tell them, what are you doing? What are you doing? And so with all that in context, well, look down at verse 8, Jeremiah 7:8. Behold, you're trusting in deceptive words to no avail. Will you steal, murder, and commit adultery, and swear falsely, and offer sacrifices to Baal, and walk after other gods that you've not known? Then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, we are delivered, that you may do all these abominations? God is trying to make the point. I don't want your sacrifices, I want your obedience. That's why he says what he does in Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 22. Yes, Boyd.
There's one word in there that really jumps out to me that says, I did not just give them commands.
Okay.
Take that word out and you change the context, but with that word in there, it simply says, that wasn't all I told them,
Right.
all by itself.
Now, of course, this is based on an English translation, but when scholars came to that, some of them said, well, let's put the word just in there because we think it's in the text. It's sort of like when Jesus said, well, how did Jesus say we're supposed to feel towards our mom and dad? If any man comes to me and does not hate his father and his mother, wait a minute, is that a contradiction?
It just means love less than you do love the Lord. You really get the context of the word hate there. It's not hate to the point you want to kill them or murder or anything like that. It's just the fact that you can't put your family or loved ones or whoever above God. You got to love God more.
So when you're looking at your relationship with God and your relationship with your parents, people would look at those in comparison and say, wow, he loves God so much, it's as if he hates his parents. Because he doesn't put his parents on a pedestal to follow and obey them, he follows God. But what does God command us to do with regard to our parents? Honor your parents. Jesus is trying to make a point. It's what the hillbilly would call a hyperbole. It's one of them hyperboles. What's a hyperbole? It's actually a hyperbole, which is a means of expressing something by saying the extreme. I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times. Now, do you really mean literally you've told them 1,000 times, or are you just trying to make the point, I've told you enough that you ought to know? That's what that's all about. We understand hyperbole. We understand using an extreme example to make a point. We do it all the time. Usually it's in a negative context. You do that again, I'm going to take your head off. Okay, I hope that's a hyperbole.
In the context of sacrifice here, God's telling you, I don't want your sacrifice. Verse 25 says, but this is what I say, I command them, saying, obey my voice, and I will be your God, and you will be my people.
Yes.
You know, in some way you can do this, is obey and stop sacrificing to other gods that are not gods.
That's right. If you go to Micah, let's see, chapter 6. Micah chapter 6, the prophet Micah is inspired by God to express some of the same sentiments. Micah chapter 6, verse 6. With what shall I come to the Lord and bow myself before the God on high? Shall I come to him with burnt offerings, with yearling calves? According to the law, how would you answer that? Well, according to the law, yes. That's what the law commanded. But then he asked, does the Lord take delight in thousands of rams, in 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I present my firstborn for my rebellious acts, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? What's he doing here? He's using an extreme example of sacrifice. He starts off talking about the animals that were commanded to be offered by the law. Then he says, well, what if instead of animals, let's get a more important sacrifice, my firstborn. What he's trying to do here is illustrate the point that it's not about sacrifices. With God, it's never been about sacrifices. It's always been about the relationship and the obedience. Verse 8, He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Now, does that mean, I get it, Micah, we don't have to offer the sacrifices anymore? If you were a Jew living in Micah's day, would the sacrifices be required? Well, of course they would. But is that the point in God's mind? Or is it justice, kindness, and walking humbly with God? The same thing is brought up by David himself in the 51st Psalm. A lot of scholars, researchers believe that David wrote this psalm based on his sin with Bathsheba. Actually, based on his repentance of his sin with Bathsheba. Let's see what he says here. Psalm 51, verse 14, Deliver me from blood guiltiness, O God, the God of my salvation. Then my tongue will joyfully sing of your righteousness. O Lord, open my lips that my mouth may declare your praise. For you do not delight in sacrifice, otherwise I would give it. You are not pleased with burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit. A broken and a contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. What is David saying? Is he saying that, I don't need to offer sacrifices according to the law? Or is he saying that what God really wants is for me to be upset because I've sinned? That's the whole point of the law, to bring us to the knowledge of sin. It's not the sacrifice. It's the sin. It's the relationship. Questions, comments, observations? Anybody got anything? Now, if I'm never not clear on any of this, don't hesitate to say, I'm not sure where you're going with that, Marty. What are you trying to say? Everybody clear on what we're talking about here? It's okay if you're not. Probably means I just haven't explained it very well. All right then, let's go to the next one. Was Jesus taken to Caiaphas or to Annas first? I need 4 readers. I need a reader for Matthew. Who's going to read from Matthew, 1 verse? All right, Linda and then Bob. Linda, you've got Matthew 26:57. Bob, you've got Mark 14:53. Who will read 1 verse from Luke? All right, Chuck, you've got Luke 22:54. And then John. You've got Big John. One more reader. John 18:13. All right, Johnny. Johnny's going to read from John. And here's the question. Was Jesus taken to Caiaphas or was he taken to Annas first? All right, Matthew 26:57.
And they that had taken Jesus led him away to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together.
All right, where was he taken? To the house of Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the high priest. That's all it says. Does Matthew say anything about Annas? He does not say anything about Annas. He just says he was taken to the house of Caiaphas, and Caiaphas was at that time the high priest. All right, Mark 14:53.
And they led Jesus to the high priest and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together.
All right. Anybody named? Nobody's named. It simply says they took Jesus where? To the high priest. Luke.
And seizing him, they led him away, took him into the house of the high priest. He followed.
All right. Where'd they take him in Luke's account? to the house of the high priest. Who was the high priest? Caiaphas was the high priest. Now we get to John. John's going to mess everything up for us.
Just one verse 13.
Just verse 13.
And led him to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, who was high priest that year.
So did they take him to Caiaphas first, or did they take him to Annas first? John says they took him to Annas first. But here's the question. Does that contradict anything that Matthew, Mark, or Luke have said? Did Matthew, Mark, or Luke say that they took him to the house of the high priest first? Why did they take him to Annas? Well, here's a little bit of historical information. Annas was Caiaphas' father-in-law. Annas had been the high priest, but he was deposed and put down by Herod, and his son-in-law, Caiaphas, was made high priest in his place. So for the Jews, probably what they were thinking was, we really like Annas the best. He's our real high priest, but he's not the official high priest. So let's take him to Annas and see what Annas has to say. They took him to Annas, and after talking with Annas about Jesus and the whole situation, then they took him to Caiaphas. So they took him to Annas first. In their minds, he was the real authority, but then they took him to Caiaphas because Caiaphas was the technical authority. Does any writer, Matthew, Mark, or Luke, contradict the idea that they took him to Annas first? They don't. They simply say they took him to Caiaphas. Did they take him to Caiaphas? Well, sure they took him to Caiaphas. Did they also take him to Annas? Yes, they took him to Annas. But John says they took him to Annas first, and then they took him to the high priest.
Marty, with the reasoning thinking that the other guy's the one that they, high priest they really liked, and because he's opposed. It said the first they took him to the high priest, didn't say which one. Then you realize they took him to this guy because this is the one I really cared about. But this other guy's the official one now, so we actually took him to both of them. Because, you know, if I had somebody needed resolved, and I knew this one lawyer was especially in this field or something, but yet this other lawyer's my lawyer team over here. I want to confer with this guy first before I realize what they need to do.
Right.
Because, you know, the more understanding, more wisdom you have about the situation, the better off you'd be. So here these people are bringing him forth and saying, okay, what should we do with this person? And he said, well, this is the resigning high priest now. You need to go him also, and not actually undermine his authority. How you get there.
Anybody ever get a second opinion? Jenny?
Well, I don't know how this goes, but if they've already been a high priest before, wouldn't you still call them high priest, just like we say President Reagan or President Bush or whatever? You know, we don't go back to just calling him Ronald.
Yes, that's true. They probably would have referred to Caiaphas as a high priest, even though he wasn't technically any longer the high priest, because he had been. But the question would then be, did Matthew, Mark, and Luke actually record that they were taking him to Caiaphas' house, or Annas' house rather? I believe each of those writers, when they talked about the high priest, was talking about Caiaphas. I couldn't prove that, but that's my assumption. And then Annas says, oh, now, you need to know this. The Holy Spirit inspired me to let you know they took him to Annas first. Took him to Annas, and then they took him to Caiaphas. But all four accounts are perfectly accurate. Bob?
Did they do that at night, which is against the Jewish law?
It was early in the morning, if I'm not mistaken. Now, you might be right. I might be making a contradiction here, contradicting myself, because I hadn't thought about that until you asked the question, but my impression is that they did it in the morning.
I thought most of that was done at night.
Some of it, well, he was arrested at night. They came into the garden with torches because it was dark. But all of these things, I believe, were taking place the next morning. Yes?
The reason why John's account says that they took him first to Annas, the word first, he specifically points out that that's where they went first, as if it's a kind of a footnote to history or whatever you want to say.
Yes.
As opposed to actually going to the high priest.
And why would you use the word first? I think this is what you're pointing out. Why would you insert the word first?
It's order of precedence
Because there was something that came
before.
second. We did this. Oh, but we did this first. So you've already got the second established. It's a well-known fact that they took him to Caiaphas. But John is pointing out, they took him to Annas first. First before what? First before they took him to Caiaphas. It all makes perfect sense. But when you're looking for something to criticize, you can find it. And have you noticed that there are a lot of people in life who are self-appointed critics? There's a reason for that. It's so easy. It's so easy. You can always find fault if that's what you're looking for. And in this case, you can find fault when there is no fault. So it's the easiest thing in the world to do. It's much more complex and complicated to find ways to compliment and encourage and exhort, if you want to use a religious sounding word, and to do something that helps somebody along. I mean, it's the simplest thing in the world to tear somebody down. And destruction is the same way. If you want to go in your house and destroy something, what do you have to do? Hardly anything. You just push something over. I'll just hit that with something. You can tear things up. But if you want to replace or repair, especially if you want to repair, well, that takes a lot of work. That takes thought. You've got to have tools and you've got to have some ingenuity. Is it easy to put a hole in sheetrock? Yes, it is. I've done it several times. Not meaning to. Anybody ever repaired a hole in sheetrock? And even when you get it done, unless you really do it right, it doesn't look the same. Come to my house, I'll show you. And so we've got people who are finding fault because it's easy, even when there is no fault. And it takes work on our part to research and to determine that there is no fault. But think about what we're doing in this class. We are saying to God, we believe in your word. We're going to find evidences to believe in your word because we know they're there. And so far, have we found them? They've always been there. There's always been reason to believe in what the scriptures say is accurate.
Marty?
Yes?
Another point here too is, I was looking at John 18 where Johnny read, and also Matthew 26, talking about leading way to Annas first, and then Caiaphas, the other two priests. But in Matthew 26, in verse 59, it says, after they're talking about here, they're talking about trying to find fault with Christ, and mocking and everything. And so they led him, and they had led laid hold on Jesus and led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and elders were assembled. But the next verse says, and the chief priests. So there's an order of people here we're going through. There's the high priests, Annas, Caiaphas, and the chief priests. There's other priests that are also trying to find fault with him to condemn him and put him to death. So it's not just one person doing this. It's a whole group of people conspiring to put Christ to death.
Right.
Actually, Matthew 26, 57 through 62, there talks about the other high priest and stuff.
And Bob's got me, Bob is making me want to do some research now to find out if there is a more exact timeline as far as whether these things were taking place that night or the next morning.
Well, it says that they bound him and led him away. It said they caught it. They bound him and led him away.
Yes? Well, I'm just going to have to look at this.
Did they leave him somewhere else to keep him from, or it said they led him away and they gave him his house?
Well, either way would be true. If they led him away and took him to Caiaphas' house, well, somebody might interject, well, they didn't take him to Caiaphas until the next morning. There's nothing in the text to say one way or the other. That's where I'm stuck, so.
In Mark's note, it says the middle of the night.
Middle of the night? On what verse?
On 18:12. Say that Jesus was taken immediately to the high priest, even though it was the middle of the night.
All right, well, here's our study question for next week. Bob, I'm glad you brought this up. This is the kind of stuff that causes us, this, if you will, the catalyst. I'm not saying you're a rancher, just saying this is that makes us look a little harder to answer a certain question that might never have come up otherwise. How long was the Egyptian captivity? That's our next question, because the detractors say that there's a contradiction in Scripture based on this. I need 3 readers for this one. I need one for Genesis 15:13. Genesis 15:13. Who'll read it? Any English readers in here? Jake, Genesis 15:13. Exodus chapter 12 and verse 40. Did I see it? Linda's got a hand up. And Galatians 3:17. Did I see a hand over here a while ago? Okay, Amy. It's Genesis 15:13, Exodus 12:40, and Galatians 3:17. Another passage, if you want to just make note of it, is Acts chapter 7 and verse 6. But I think with the first 3, we can go ahead and answer this seeming contradiction. In Acts 7:6 will just be a footnote to it. Okay, Genesis 15:13.
And God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years.
All right, what does God say to Abraham about the timeline for his people's oppression and slavery? 400 years for what? Oppression and slavery. 400 years for oppression and slavery. Now, Exodus 12:40.
Now the time that the children of Israel dwelt in Egypt was 430 years.
Oh, the time that the Israelites dwelt in Egypt was how long? 430 years. Does that sound like a contradiction? Why isn't it not a contradiction, Johnny?
Because they were oppressed for a while before they were enslaved.
Or is it vice versa? When the Israelites went to Egypt, did they go down there as slaves? No, they went down there as free men. They were even given, what were they given when they went to Egypt? They were given the land of Goshen, which was the best land around. Why did they give them the land of Goshen? Because the Egyptians thought, well, these lowly Hebrews, they're not as good as we are. We don't want to associate with them. Stick them out there in the land of Goshen. Even though that was the best land, that was a place where they could be separate from the Egyptians. What happened among the Israelites that caused the Egyptians to eventually fear them? They multiplied so fast. You remember the story of Moses? Where was Moses when he was found as a baby? Why was he in the river? Because the new Pharaoh, the Pharaoh that loved Joseph, had died, and the new Pharaoh said, wow, these Egyptians or these Hebrews are multiplying so fast, they're going to overtake us. So he ordered that all of the Hebrew male children be put to death. As soon as they're born, kill them. So Amram and Yoshabel was Moses' mom, she fashioned a basket, lined it with pitch, tar, whatever it was, to make it waterproof and float, and set Moses afloat adrift in the bulrushes. And somehow, just by coincidence, Pharaoh's daughter came down and found him and decided to adopt him. That's how all that happened. So is it possible that they were in Egypt for 430 years but were only oppressed for 400 years? I think that's a possibility. Did we not read the other one, Galatians 3:17? Amy forgot that I said, Marty, talk so long, I forgot I was supposed to read.
What I'm saying is this: the law which came 430 years later does not invalidate the covenant previously ratified by God, so as to nullify the promise.
Okay, 430 years later than what? 430 years later than when God promised to Abram that his people would go into a land and possess it, and that he would bless him bless all the nations through him. So there was Abram. God made the promises to Abram, but the law, the old law, the Jewish law, that didn't come till 430 years later, because it was 430 years later that the Israelites came out of captivity and were given the law on Mount Sinai. Questions, comments, observations? We've had one bell. probably shouldn't delve into another one because the other bell is going to be coming pretty soon. So I've got 2 research questions for next week. How long did it not rain under Elijah's proclamation, and Esther and the sons of Haman being slain? Any others? Anybody has at the moment? And you can write them down and submit them through the week. If nobody has any questions or observations?
I got one.
Oh, all right.
It's pertaining to the last one, but 430 years, then it says your people will be oppressed for 400 years.
Yes.
I don't quite see the contradiction in it because, under Joseph, right, the tribes of Judah came, or not Judah, but you know what I'm talking about. Tribes of Israel came as guests.
Okay.
Initially.
Right.
And it states throughout the Bible, the Old Testament, that they multiplied and the Pharaohs grew to fear them. Wouldn't it make sense that it would take 30 years for them to multiply that fast?
Yes.
Where they might become a potential threat to the
And-
to the Egyptians?
And that's what I believe happened. They were there for 30 years in peace, living in harmony, whatever the harmony might have been, and then they were made slaves after 30 years. So the next 400 years, they were enslaved and in bondage and, what was the other word, afflicted. But the first 30 years, they were having a heyday.
Well, and it doesn't say 400 exactly
Right.
years. It's not precisely to the day.
It's interesting, though, it does say 430 years to the day. I forget which one of the texts it was that did that, but it said 430 years to the day. It didn't say 400, but 430 to the day, which is a pretty bold statement to make in ancient records, but it's accurate. That was, in fact, the second bell. So we're officially dismissed.